everyone, Tiffany here with another cosplay tutorial, and on this Tips videos, we're going to be going over how I made my Permafrost Cape from the game World of Warcraft. As always, you need in-game reference images, so here you go. And with the help of these reference images, I made a 2-scale template of the Permafrost Cape, which is available on my website. See the link below. And if you use this template, remember to print it out, tape it together, and I definitely recommend actually coloring it. Because this template is so complex, it's really helpful to color each section so you know which one you're working on and which one to cut out at a time. I then traced each section onto tracing paper and cut out with an Excel blade, taped it onto veg tan leather, and then made an indentation into the leather so I knew where to cut. I do this rather than using a pen or a Sharpie to help prevent the pen from bleeding onto the surface of the leather. The next step was to cut out each leather section using an Excel blade. Remember, you always want to have extremely sharp blades. Do not use a dull blade or you will have fluffy leather edges. For the smaller background pieces, I used a black leather and cut out again with an Excel blade. You can see here all of the main pieces of leather that's been cut out. For the main part of the cape, which all the pieces are going to be attached to, I used a thin piece of black leather cowhide as well. Now to add color to all of the pieces. For all of the gold pieces, I first started with a base coat of copper airbrush paint. I then painted it with gold airbrush paint, making sure to only do it in certain areas so the copper would still show through the gold paint. For all of the blue gem pieces, I first started with a base coat of turquoise paint, and then I progressed to a white color in the center, followed by a dark blue color on the outside to kind of give it more of a glowing effect. For the background detail pieces, I painted some purple airbrush paint onto all of the black leather and painted all of the gold detail pieces by hand using the tester's airbrush paint as well. Here's all the purple detail pieces once they're done. For the main cape part, I painted all of the pieces blue, as well as the backside of the cape. I will note that painting the backside of any leather hide will cause you to use a lot more paint than the front side, just because the leather will absorb more. I then cut out main sections of my template and then traced it onto the cape using black and silver Sharpies to help me know where to airbrush paint and to glue pieces later. I next worked on the top part of the cape, painting highlights in light blues and shadows with dark blues, and did the same process for the bottom part of the cape as well. And here's all of the pieces laid out on top of each other once they were done being painted. Now let's talk about how I attached all of the pieces. I first started with all of the background purple pieces, applying leather weld glue to the back side of the pieces and evenly spreading it out using a toothpick. And while the glue was still wet, I applied it to the main part of the cape. You then want to use a napkin and apply pressure, and then apply some object to sit on top of it to apply pressure until the glue is fully dry. I used 2-pound weight bags. And here's all of the purple pieces once they are attached to the main leather cape. Then, using a leather sewing needle and my sewing machine, I sewed each of the purple pieces onto the main cape. Just using the glue will hold the pieces together, but if you're planning on traveling or doing any type of bending of the cape, you want to ensure that it's fully attached, so I do recommend sewing each piece. Now for each of the gold pieces of trim as well as the blue pieces of gems, I used a leather buffing tool and buffed the surface of each piece, followed by rounding each of the edges so that way the leather was no longer sharp on the sides. I then repeated the same process for attaching the blue gem pieces to the cape, as well as sewing the pieces to the cape. For the gold trim, I separated all of the pieces into 3 sections. I first started with the outside main section of the gold trim and applied the leather weld glue to the back side of the leather gold trim, only in about 5 inches at a time. And then repeated, applying pressure with a paper towel and cleaning up any extra glue, and slowly worked from the bottom part of the cape to the top part. If you apply glue to too large of a section, the glue will actually dry before you are able to attach the gold trim to the main cape. As always, don't forget to wipe up any extra glue that comes out from underneath the gold trim. And here is what the cape looks like after the first gold piece section is glued to the cape. Once that section was dry, I then sewed each of the gold piece trims using a leather needle and my sewing machine. Because the cape is really wide, it made it very difficult to sew, and I had to roll up the leather at times and had to stop and start the stitching quite often, so there was a lot of extra little threads on the top and back surface. I do recommend trimming all of these threads once you are done sewing the first gold trim, so that way they do not cause problems for sewing later. Now, on to the next piece. I then worked with the upper middle section of gold trim, again repeating the whole gluing process. And when that gold section was done being glued, I then glued the middle blue ring down as well. And here's what the cape looks like once those two sections were glued down. And the next step was then to sew the gold section, as well as the blue section. I do recommend sewing as you go along with this. If you were to sew at the very end once all pieces are glued, it would be a lot more harder and it would be more difficult for the leather to bend around and to get to all of the pieces that you need to sew. And don't forget to trim all of the extra threads from the top and the back side. And last, to attach the main intricate gold detail piece. Once again, repeating all said previous steps. And here's what the last gold trim section looks like once it is glued to the cape. And of course, you want to sew this piece as well. This is the last piece that needed to be sewn on, and after this you'll want to trim every single piece of thread, as well as on the back side. I then used scissors to trim the edge so that way they all aligned evenly, and then I felt that the cape needed a little bit more pop to it, so by hand I applied a little bit of black airbrush paint to all of the edges of the trim. For the top cape buttons, I imported my base 2D lines from Adobe Illustrator into a 3D modeling program called Rhino 6 and made my 3D model for the buttons. I then 3D printed it on my Prusa i3 Mark 2.5 3D printer in PETG filament and removed all of the back support structure, as well as I filed all of the stair steps away. To remove even more of the stair step look that a 3D printer gives, I applied a coat of sandable spray paint. Once it was dry, I then sanded so that way the surface was all flat. For painting the piece, I started with a base coat of black airbrush paint, followed by copper, and then added gold airbrush paint in sections. And for a little bit more pop to the piece, I applied by hand using black airbrush paint to the little indentation crease things. And once all of the paint was dry, I then applied a coat of satin clear enamel spray paint to seal the piece. For attaching the buttons to the cape, I then used tracing paper to trace where the pegs were on the back of the buttons, cut out the holes from the tracing paper, and then used a Sharpie to trace where those holes were onto the leather. I then used an Excel blade to cut out the holes, and then applied leather weld glue to the back side of the button. And then while the glue was still wet, I attached it to the cape and put the 2-pound weight bags on either side to hold it together while it dries. All that's left is to attach the cape to the cosplay, and then my Permafrost Cape from the game World of Warcraft was complete.